On July 23, 2016, Dr. James Whitmore made a discovery that should have been the greatest moment of his career. He was excavating a temple complex in southern Mexico, searching for the final piece of evidence that would prove his life's work. For 30 years, he'd argued that the ancient Olmec civilization had been influenced by trans-Pacific contact with Asian seafarers around 1200 BCE. His theory was revolutionary, controversial, and supported by just enough evidence to make it plausible. That day, his team uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the temple. Inside were artifacts that would finally settle the debate. Pottery fragments, tool marks, organic material for carbon dating. James carefully documented everything, following the protocols he'd perfected over 3 decades. Then he saw it. A piece of carved jade with unmistakable iconography. The kind of smoking gun evidence that ends academic arguments forever. Except the evidence didn't support his theory. It demolished it. The jade carving, the pottery styles, the carbon dating results, everything pointed to the exact opposite conclusion. Not only was there no trans-Pacific contact, but the cultural development he'd attributed to outside influence was purely indigenous. Brilliant, sophisticated, and completely homegrown. James Whitmore had just proven that his entire career was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. Every paper he'd published, every lecture he'd given, every student he'd taught, all of it was wrong. And he had 2 choices. He could bury the evidence and protect his legacy. Or he could publish the truth and destroy everything he'd built. This is the story of what happened when a scientist had to choose between being right and being honest. And why that choice is far more complicated than anyone wants to believe. James Whitmore wasn't supposed to become an archaeologist. He grew up in rural Indiana, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. No one in his family had gone to college. But James was obsessed with ancient civilizations from childhood. He spent every Saturday at the library, reading everything he could find about Egypt, Rome, the Maya, the Aztecs. In 1983, at age 18, he won a full scholarship to Indiana University. He graduated summa cum laude 4 years later. Got his PhD from Berkeley in 1992. And by 1995, at age 30, he was leading his first major excavation in Mexico. That's when he developed the theory that would define his career. He was studying Olmec head sculptures, those massive stone heads that are among the most iconic artifacts of Mesoamerican archaeology. Something about them bothered him. The facial features. The artistic style. They didn't match other indigenous art forms from the region. They looked different. Some scholars had noted Asian features in the sculptures. James took that observation and built a comprehensive theory around it. He proposed that around 1200 BCE, seafarers from ancient China had made contact with the Gulf Coast of Mexico. That this contact had influenced Olmec art, religious practices, and technological development. The theory was explosive. If true, it would rewrite the history of pre-Columbian America. It would mean that ancient civilizations weren't as isolated as everyone believed. That transoceanic contact happened thousands of years before Columbus. The academic establishment hated it. They called it pseudoscience. They said James was pushing a narrative that diminished indigenous achievement. That he was suggesting Native American civilizations needed outside help to develop complex culture. James argued back. He said he wasn't diminishing anything. He was proposing cultural exchange, not cultural supremacy. He published paper after paper. Each one carefully argued. Each one supported by physical evidence. Pottery styles that matched Chinese designs. Jade working techniques that appeared simultaneously in both regions. Botanical evidence of plants that shouldn't have existed in pre-Columbian Mexico. By 2005, James had won over enough scholars to shift the conversation. His theory was still controversial, but it was now considered legitimate enough to debate. He got tenure at UC San Diego. Published a best-selling book called The Pacific Bridge. Appeared on documentaries. Lectured worldwide. Students competed to work with him. He became the archaeologist who'd proven ancient civilizations were connected long before anyone realized. His entire professional identity was built on this foundation. And then, on a summer day in 2016, the foundation cracked. The 2016 excavation was supposed to be James's triumph. He'd spent 5 years getting permits and funding to dig at a site called Tres Zapotes in Veracruz, Mexico. Previous expeditions had found tantalizing hints of the evidence James needed. Botanical remains that might prove trans-Pacific plant transfer. Pottery fragments with suspicious similarities to Asian ceramics. But nothing definitive. Nothing that would end the debate once and for all. James assembled his team carefully. 15 researchers. Graduate students from multiple universities. Specialists in ceramics, metallurgy, botany, and carbon dating. He wanted this excavation to be bulletproof. Every artifact documented with obsessive precision. Every finding peer-reviewed in real time. They broke ground in May 2016. The first 3 weeks yielded promising results. More pottery fragments. Tool marks that suggested advanced metalworking techniques. Then, in the 4th week, ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly. A void beneath the main temple structure. Probably a burial chamber or ritual space. James's team spent 2 days carefully excavating the entrance. Ancient Maya builders had sealed it with limestone blocks and clay. When they finally broke through, James was the first to enter. His headlamp illuminated a chamber about the size of a small bedroom. The walls were covered in carved reliefs. The floor was littered with broken pottery and ceremonial objects. And in the center, on a stone altar, sat a collection of jade artifacts that took James's breath away. Jade was precious to Olmec culture. It represented life, fertility, and divine power. These pieces were extraordinary. Intricately carved. Obviously ceremonial. But it was the iconography that mattered. The symbols carved into the jade would tell James whether his theory was right. If they showed Asian influence, Chinese symbolic elements, anything that suggested cultural transmission from across the Pacific, he'd have his proof. James spent the next 3 days photographing and documenting every piece. He brought in his ceramic specialist to analyze the pottery. His botanist to examine organic residue. His carbon dating expert to collect samples for radiocarbon analysis. Everyone was excited. The team could feel they were on the verge of something significant. Then the carbon dating results came back. The artifacts dated to approximately 1150 BCE. Exactly the right timeframe for James's theory. The pottery analysis came next. And that's when things started to go wrong. The ceramics specialist, Dr. Maria Gonzalez, came to James's tent with a troubled expression. She said the pottery styles didn't match any known Asian ceramics from that period. They were purely Olmec. Sophisticated, but indigenous. James wasn't too worried yet. Pottery styles could be ambiguous. The jade was what mattered. He sent photos of the jade carvings to 3 independent experts. One in Beijing. One in London. One at Harvard. He asked them to identify the symbolic systems used in the carvings. Their responses all came back within a week. And they all said the same thing. The symbols were not Chinese. Not Japanese. Not from any known Asian cultural tradition. They were pure Mesoamerican. Sophisticated. Complex. And completely homegrown. James sat with those reports for 2 days, trying to find alternative interpretations. But the evidence was overwhelming. Everything in that chamber pointed to indigenous development. No outside influence. No cultural transmission. No trans-Pacific contact. His theory was wrong. James didn't tell his team immediately. He needed time to process what this meant. He'd built his entire career on the trans-Pacific contact theory. He'd published 19 peer-reviewed papers supporting it. He'd written a book that had sold over 100,000 copies. He'd mentored dozens of graduate students who'd built their own careers on related research. And now he had definitive proof that it was all wrong. The ethical path was obvious. Publish the findings. Acknowledge the error. Let the scientific community correct the record. But the consequences of that path were devastating. His academic reputation would be destroyed. His book would be discredited. His former students would see their own work questioned. Universities that had hired researchers based on his theories would face criticism. And James himself would go from celebrated scholar to cautionary tale about confirmation bias. He was 51 years old. If he published the truth, he'd spend the rest of his career as the archaeologist who'd been spectacularly wrong. But there was another option. The chamber contents were catalogued only by his team. The carbon dating had been done at a private lab he'd used for years. The expert consultations had been informal. Nothing had been officially published yet. He could simply not report what he'd found. He could focus the final report on other aspects of the excavation. Mention the jade artifacts briefly but emphasize the ambiguous pottery fragments instead. Let the definitive evidence sit in storage while he quietly retired in a few years with his reputation intact. It would be easy. Archaeologists make judgment calls about what findings are significant enough to report all the time. He wouldn't be lying. He'd just be selective about emphasis. But James knew what that was. It was academic fraud. Not the dramatic kind where you fake data or fabricate artifacts. The subtle kind where you bury inconvenient truths. The kind that was almost impossible to detect but completely corrupted the scientific process. He spent 3 weeks wrestling with the decision. He talked to no one. His team noticed he'd become withdrawn but assumed he was focused on analysis. Finally, James made his choice. On August 15, 2016, he called a meeting with his senior researchers. He presented all the evidence. He explained what it meant. And he told them they were going to publish everything, including the fact that his 30-year theory was wrong. The reaction was not what he expected. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the ceramics specialist, was relieved. She'd been worried about bringing him bad news. But Dr. Robert Chen, who'd co-authored 3 papers with James supporting the trans-Pacific theory, was furious. He said publishing this would destroy both their careers. That James was being self-destructive. That they could interpret the evidence differently. James listened to every objection. Then he said something that defined his character more than anything he'd published in 30 years. He said, "I became an archaeologist to discover the truth about the past. Not to protect my own ego. If we bury this evidence because it hurts our careers, we're not scientists. We're just people playing dress-up in the ruins of civilizations we claim to respect." The team voted. 10 supported publishing everything. 3 wanted to minimize the contradictory findings. 2 abstained. It was enough. James began writing what would become the most difficult paper of his career. James submitted the paper to the Journal of Archaeological Science in September 2016. The title was direct and devastating: Re-evaluating Trans-Pacific Contact Theory, Evidence from Trace Supports Contradicts Previous Interpretations. In the abstract, he wrote something that made editors pause. He said, "This paper presents findings that contradict 30 years of my own published research. The evidence suggests that Olmec cultural development was entirely indigenous, with no detectable trans-Pacific influence." Academic papers don't usually include that kind of self-correction. Most researchers who discover they're wrong publish the new findings and quietly distance themselves from previous work. They don't explicitly announce they were wrong for 3 decades. The paper went through peer review. The reviewers were skeptical not because the evidence was weak, but because it was so strong. One reviewer wrote, "The author's willingness to completely overturn his own life's work suggests either remarkable intellectual honesty or a psychological break. The evidence, however, is sound." The paper was published in December 2016. The archaeological community's response was immediate and vicious. Other scholars who'd built careers opposing James's theory didn't celebrate being vindicated. They were angry that he'd wasted 30 years of the field's time and resources on a wrong theory. Researchers who'd supported James felt betrayed. They'd staked their own reputations on work that was now discredited. Some accused him of deliberately misleading them. Graduate students who'd written dissertations based on transpacific contact theory found themselves with credentials that were suddenly worthless. One former student, Dr. Lisa Park, published an editorial saying James should return his salary from the years he'd taught the wrong theory. The media attention was brutal. Science journalists who'd written favorable articles about the Pacific Bridge now wrote pieces about academic hubris and confirmation bias. James became a case study in how even respected scientists can be catastrophically wrong. But the professional consequences were worse than the public embarrassment. UC San Diego began an investigation into whether James had committed academic misconduct. The university argued that by publishing research he should have known was flawed, he'd violated ethical standards. James's defense was simple: he'd believed the evidence at the time. He'd followed rigorous methodology. He'd been wrong, but he hadn't been dishonest. The investigation dragged on for 8 months. During that time, James was placed on administrative leave. His graduate students were reassigned to other advisors. His research funding was frozen. Other universities canceled scheduled lectures. Textbook publishers removed chapters based on his work. The National Science Foundation revoked a $2.3 million grant his team had been awarded. In May 2017, UC San Diego cleared James of misconduct but declined to renew his tenure. The official statement said the university was restructuring its archaeology department to focus on different research priorities. It was a polite way of forcing him out. James was 52 years old, unemployed, and radioactive to other institutions. No university wanted to hire the archaeologist who'd been spectacularly wrong. But something unexpected happened. A small liberal arts college in Vermont offered him a position. Not a prestigious research university. Just a teaching college with 40 students in the archaeology program. They said they wanted someone who understood that science was about finding truth, not protecting ego. Someone who could teach students that being wrong with integrity was more important than being right through deception. James accepted. James Whitmore has been teaching at Middlebury College in Vermont for 7 years now. He makes a fraction of what he earned at UC San Diego. He lives in a small apartment instead of the house he sold to pay legal fees. He's not famous anymore. Most people in the archaeological community have moved on. But something interesting happened after the dust settled. James's 2016 paper became one of the most cited publications in archaeological methodology. Not because of what it discovered about the Olmec, but because of what it demonstrated about scientific integrity. Researchers started using it as a teaching tool. It appeared in ethics courses, philosophy of science seminars, courses on research methodology. It became the example people pointed to when discussing what science should be. The willingness to be wrong. The courage to admit error. The integrity to publish findings that destroy your own work. In 2019, a researcher at MIT named Dr. Sarah Kim published a paper called The Whitmore Effect: How Public Self-Correction Advances Science More Than Being Right. She analyzed 20 years of archaeological research and found something remarkable. Fields where researchers openly admitted and corrected their errors advanced faster than fields where mistakes were quietly buried. James's brutal honesty had accidentally created a model for how science should work. But the real impact was smaller. more personal. James's students at Middlebury tell a different story about him than his students at UC San Diego told. At San Diego, he was the famous archaeologist with the big theory. Students competed to work with him because of his reputation. At Middlebury, students want to work with him because of what he represents. He teaches them that archaeology isn't about proving you're right. It's about discovering what's true. That the goal isn't to build a career. It's to understand the past. That admitting you're wrong is harder than being right, but it's the only thing that matters. One of his students, Emily Rodriguez, wrote her senior thesis on Olmec metallurgy. Her research contradicted one of James's old papers from 2003. When she brought her findings to him, nervous about contradicting her professor, James's response defined why his students love him. He said, "This is excellent work. You've proven I was wrong about something else. Congratulations. Let's publish it together." They did. James co-authored a paper where he was listed as second author, supporting research that contradicted his own previous work. Again, the paper's acknowledgments included a line that made other researchers pause. "We thank Dr. James Whitmore for demonstrating that the best way to honor your past work is to let better research surpass it." In 2022, James received an unexpected honor. The American Archaeological Association gave him their Ethics in Research Award. The citation read, "For demonstrating that scientific integrity requires not just rigorous methodology, but the moral courage to accept when our most cherished beliefs are wrong." James almost didn't attend the ceremony. He felt like a fraud receiving an ethics award for essentially admitting he'd been wrong for 30 years. But his colleagues convinced him. They said he'd taught the field something more valuable than any discovery. He'd shown that science works not because scientists are always right, but because honest scientists are willing to be wrong. At the ceremony, James gave a 5-minute acceptance speech. He said something that's been quoted in every archaeological ethics course since. "I spent 30 years being spectacularly wrong. And I thought that meant I'd failed as a scientist. But I've learned something. Being wrong is easy. Everyone's wrong about something. The hard part is having the integrity to admit it when you discover your error. To publish it. To face the consequences. To let the truth matter more than your ego. That's what science is. Not being right. But being honest enough to accept when you're wrong." Today, James Whitmore is 59 years old. He'll never recover the career he had. He'll never get back the reputation he lost. He'll never undo the 30 years he spent being wrong. But he's at peace with that. Because he learned something that most people never learn. That your legacy isn't built on being right. It's built on what you do when you discover you're wrong. The archaeology James spent 30 years studying has moved on without him. Olmec research has advanced significantly since his paper. New excavations have revealed even more evidence of sophisticated indigenous development. The field now understands that pre-Columbian civilizations were far more innovative and complex than anyone, including James, gave them credit for. James's theory didn't just fail. It was based on a subtle form of cultural bias. The assumption that indigenous peoples needed outside influence to achieve greatness. That extraordinary accomplishment required extraordinary explanation. The real story was more remarkable. The Olmec didn't need Asian seafarers to teach them jade carving. They figured it out themselves. They didn't need Chinese influence to develop sophisticated art. They created it from their own cultural vision. James had spent 30 years looking for evidence of contact because he couldn't imagine indigenous Americans achieving what they achieved alone. He'd been wrong in a way that was deeper than just misinterpreting evidence. He'd been wrong about what questions to ask. But in being wrong, and admitting it, he'd taught the next generation of archaeologists to ask better questions. To check their biases. To remember that the goal of archaeology isn't to impose our narratives on the past. It's to let the past speak for itself. His former students, the ones who didn't blame him for their career complications, say James gave them something more valuable than correct theories. He taught them intellectual humility. The ability to hold expertise and uncertainty at the same time. To be confident in your methods while remaining open to being wrong about your conclusions. One of them, now a professor herself, put it this way: James showed us that you can be a brilliant archaeologist and completely wrong about something fundamental. And that the measure of a scholar isn't whether they're right. It's whether they have the courage to change their mind when the evidence demands it. There's a moment from James's story that captures everything about why integrity matters more than reputation. In 2020, during the pandemic, James recorded a series of lectures for his students who were learning remotely. In one lecture, he was discussing archaeological interpretation. A student asked him how to know when to trust published research if even experts can be wrong for decades. James thought for a moment. Then he said something that went viral among archaeology students. You can't always trust research to be right. But you can trust honest researchers to correct themselves when they're wrong. The difference between good science and bad science isn't that good scientists never make mistakes. It's that good scientists admit their mistakes and fix them. Bad scientists hide their mistakes and pretend they were right all along. That's the real lesson of James Whitmore's story. Not that scientists should never be wrong. Being wrong is inevitable. The lesson is about what you do when you discover your error. Do you protect your reputation? Or do you protect the truth? James chose truth. It cost him everything he'd built. But it gave him something more valuable. The ability to look in the mirror and know that when it mattered most, he chose integrity over comfort. And in a world that constantly pressures us to double down on our mistakes, to never admit error, to protect our image at all costs, that choice is revolutionary. James Whitmore destroyed his own career to advance human knowledge. And in doing so, he became a better scientist than he ever was when everyone thought he was right.